Well, hi everyone. Welcome to an author chat at onethingalone.com. I'm Ashrita, and today I'm thrilled to have Jennifer Smith with us, the author of The Unveiled Wife and also the blogger with that same blog. Jennifer, welcome.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm so glad you agreed to do this interview because I was part of your book launch team this spring for The Unveiled Wife. I was just so touched by your story that you shared there, and I think it's a story that will be encouraging to a lot of women. Could you tell us first a little bit about you and your family, and maybe why you started writing?
Sure. Um, so my name's Jennifer Smith. I am 29 years old. We just celebrated 8 years of marriage, and we have one child. He's 2.5, and then one on the way. So I'm just weeks away from giving birth again, which is really exciting.
Yay!
I
Congratulations!
know. Thank you. And this time we don't know what we're having, so it's even more. There's even more anticipation for the event. So we're really excited about that. Um, I first started writing on at Unveiled Wife to kind of process what I was going through as a wife. There weren't a ton of resources at the time for what I was looking for, and I just felt like I wanted to I wanted to share my experience, but also provide resources that were helping me where I was at, and hopefully inspire other wives where they're at. So I just kind of saw it as like an online journal, and then it just kind of blew up into an even bigger ministry that God intended. So I'm really excited to just participate in it, and just um, to have God trust me with it. I feel really honored.
Yeah. Well, tell us about The Unveiled Wife. Where did that name come from? When I first told my husband I was part of the launch team for that, he was like, The Unveiled Wife? What?
I know it's a different kind of name, very unique. But it came from a verse in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and it just talks about being before the Lord and having unveiled faces, and that word really stood out to me at a time when I was learning how to embrace intimacy with God. And so it's this idea of stepping into intimacy and letting down those walls in our hearts. So it's more metaphorical than it is literal of being unveiled. But there was that aspect of, when a bride walks down the aisle and she gets to the altar, she's unveiled before her husband, but then she remains unveiled. It's not like she, continues on with this big white veil on her head, traditionally speaking. Um, so there was just a few different, ideas surrounding the name, and I just thought, I'm going to go with it. In the first couple of days, I thought maybe I could be anonymous. That way I could talk about the really hard issues without people knowing who it was, which is why it wasn't jennifersmith.com or anything like that, but it probably wouldn't be available anyways because that's such a common name. So I just felt like God was leading me towards that name so that I could explain how to embrace intimacy with God and ultimately with our spouse.
Yeah. Um, I love that idea. And, I've read that verse before, and I think in the context, it talks about Moses and how he went up the mountain to meet with God. And when he came down the mountain, his face just radiated. It just shone with the reflection of the glory of God, and how he had to actually veil his face because the people were afraid.
Yeah.
Um, and that's just so inspiring for me to see that level of intimacy with God, to see him face to face and to have like a physical reflection on our faces. And then Paul says that we have unveiled faces, and the world should see that type of intimacy. But it's not easy,
Mm-mm.
Jennifer, to have that intimacy with God. Can you tell us a little bit about your story? How did you go from being a Christian and growing up with an understanding of what it means to be a Christian to actually going and becoming an unveiled Christian before God?
Yeah, I when people ask me, well, when did you get saved or when did you know the Lord? I feel like I've always known him because I was raised in a family that talked openly about God, and we went to church, here and there. Um, so I did have a foundation of who God was, and it wasn't until like junior high that I really like submitted my life to him and said, I'm going to serve you, and really just wholeheartedly believed in who he was and that he loved me. But even saying that, I didn't truly believe it. I didn't fully understand how much and how deeply God really did love me. And I tended to keep all of my relationships at a, arm's length because I was terrified of people truly knowing me, even God. And so one of the things that really helped me to embrace true intimacy with God didn't happen until my early 20s, after I had already, said my vows to my husband. And it was this idea of learning that there's a difference between intimacy and sex. Okay, and there was this idea of me learning that intimacy is not sex, because I always just thought it was the same. And there's so much more to intimacy. So when I started to do a word search and study on these two different words, I realized that intimacy means to be familiar with and to know deeply. And that's more of like a friendship aspect than physical intimacy, which would be sex. And the reason I'm even bringing that up is because, as you read my story, a big part of our marital issues surrounded sex. And so I had to learn the difference between these two words. And as I did, I realized that I wasn't as intimate with God as I thought I was, or as I wanted to be. And so I really just prayed about it and asked God to give me the understanding and the know-how to be intimate, to be truly known by Him, which is a scary thought. I didn't know what that would mean. I didn't know if that meant He would ask more of me, or if He would be upset with me, or whatever. But it was just a matter of going before Him in prayer and really sharing my heart, instead of just assuming that He knew everything, or that, I don't know, it was just communicating to God who I was, letting Him into those deep places in my heart, and letting those walls down.
So for the woman who's watching this and is saying, I do want more of God, I feel like there's got to be something more to this life than just, going to church and reading my Bible and praying, but there needs to be something more. What would you say to her?
I think my encouragement would just be to take some time by yourself, to go for a walk or sit in your room or wherever you can really find that solitude, and just talk to God about your emotions, because we are such emotional beings, and God gave us all of those ranges, from anger to bitterness to frustration to happiness and joy, and to really just sift through and evaluate where your heart's at, and just offer it to God, as an offering. Just say, God, this is where I'm at. And we won't always know why we're there. Sometimes I'm frustrated and I don't know why. So it's just a matter of saying, God, I need your help, and I want you to know who I am. And so, talking about maybe some things in your past, some things that you buried a long time ago that still are affecting you and maybe even your marriage, and allowing them to come to the surface so that God can scrape them off and get rid of them for you. That would be my encouragement.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying, just really open yourself to God and don't necessarily worry about, a to-do list or a certain
Right.
method of engaging with Him, but just simply saying, I'm here. And
Yeah.
the other thing I liked that you mentioned was when you first sensed this was you actually asked God to walk you through this, to show more of Himself to you and to show you what that looks like. That's encouraging too, because God rewards those who seeks Him.
Exactly. And I think sometimes, like you mentioned, the to-do list, especially as women, I feel like we're so bombarded with circumstance and things that we're dealing with, the right here and now, that we're so focused, especially in our prayer life, to bring those things before God. But He wants everything. He wants the thing that happened yesterday and the day before that, and our trust for tomorrow. He wants us to spend time with Him, and that requires sacrifice in other areas of our life. And so it's just a matter of making that commitment to Him and trusting Him.
Hmm. So, how did your growing intimacy with God affect your relationship with your husband? You mentioned that you had a hard time with the physical intimacy in your marriage, or the sexual part
Yeah.
of your marriage, and experiencing intimacy with him. What effect did your growing depth in your relationship with God have on your marriage with your husband?
Well, as I started to open up my heart to God fully, and trusting Him with my heart, and the things that I was wrestling with, I really feel like it gave me the courage to open up to my husband, which is something that I never really did. My husband is a very transparent man, and he's also a very patient man. But he would, explain things to me, things that he was going through, and I didn't understand how he was able to do that with me. So it wasn't until I was able to do it with God that I understood or had the courage to do it with him. And I remember specifically, and I mentioned this towards the end of my book, that I sat on the edge of our bed one night and for 2 hours cried through just everything that I was dealing with, and how our marriage issues were affecting us, and things that I thought of when I was a kid, and my parents' divorce, and just everything I brought to the table, and I said, this is who I really am. And I think so often we hide in our marriages, and we keep things isolated from our spouse knowing us, and that can be really dangerous because that hinders intimacy. And so I saw this huge correlation after doing that our intimacy with God does lead to more intimacy with our husbands, and it's through that transparency and through that getting to know one another and becoming familiar with one another that really opens up that door to do so. And then it came to a point where we both just had revelations about whether or not the sexual issues were ever going to be resolved, that we were going to be intimate, that we were going to have those deep conversations and love one another unconditionally. And I think that is what really gave us the hope to move forward in our relationship regardless of our circumstance. And so, yeah, for anyone listening right now, I just hope that that's a huge encouragement to you, that that by building intimacy with God, you will naturally increase intimacy in your marriage, because your understanding and your depth of knowledge of the how and the why and the what will just become greater.
Yeah, I love that because God created us, right? So he knows us deeply and intimately, and he loves us anyway. And you mentioned your husband's patient. My husband is patient beyond like any measure. But our husbands have faults
Yeah.
anyway, just as we do. And so there are times maybe where there's hurt in our relationship, and we don't experience the type of intimacy that we'd like to have. But with God, that intimacy is always there for us. He always waits for us with open arms. And I love how you shared that experiencing intimacy with God kind of trained you or taught you how to do that same with your husband.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what would you say to the wife who, I guess from all the different perspectives, maybe she's been married for 30 years and lacks any type of anything in common with her husband, and it just doesn't know where to start. And maybe the same thing with God too, whether, yeah, husband or God. How do you feel you can approach this intimacy when you feel like there's so much baggage in your past? Maybe you've made decisions you're ashamed of, or you're struggling with, I don't know, negative self-talk or fantasies, or maybe you've had an affair or pornography, or all these different issues that come into a relationship. Um, how can you move forward?
Yeah, I think it doesn't really matter how long you've been married, because in ministering to women, and especially wives, I've realized that it doesn't matter if you've been married 6 months or 30 years. There's all kinds of situations that arise, that happen, that can affect marriage, just like you're saying, And I think my encouragement would be to focus on your part, because so often, especially because of our sin, we want to deflect and we want to say, well, my spouse is to blame, or God's to blame. I was really angry at God for a long time. I thought I had did all the right things growing up, and so I deserved his blessing of a perfect life, and when I didn't get it, I blamed him. I said, this is your fault. And so instead of pointing the finger at everyone else or avoiding it, isolating the problem and saying, I'm not even going to deal with it, and brushing it under the rug, I would say to face it fearlessly. And I know that's easier said than done, but when we take the time to evaluate our hearts and the issues that we wrestle with, we're better able to deal with them and move forward, like you're saying. So if your goal is to move forward, if your goal is to embrace intimacy, whether it's with your spouse or with God, you're going to have to face those things that feel ugly to you or feel too hard. And so, again, I know this is easier said than done, but I would just say face them, evaluate your heart, check, do a heart check and say, God, what is it in my heart that I need to bring to the surface and talk about and repent of and move forward on. So that would be my encouragement. And I feel like
Yeah.
as we all do that, and we actually are responsible for the choices that we've made, whether it was 30 years ago or 10 years ago or 2 years ago or yesterday, when we have that responsibility to be able to face it and truly repent of it and say, I don't want to be that way anymore, I want to move forward, God honors that, and he does restore us, and he redeems whatever we feel was lost, whether it was intimacy or love or romance or being familiar with one another. That's what I would encourage with.
Yeah. Have you found this is like a one-time thing or an ongoing journey?
This is totally an ongoing journey. I don't think we'll ever reach a point where we fully know our spouse or even God, because it's a learning process, and we're also learning about who we are, right? So as we kind of open up our hearts and dissect everything that we're dealing with, we're becoming familiar with ourselves and who we are and who we want to be. And so I would say it's going to be continuing forever. As long as I've already accepted the fact that as long as I'm married, whether, it's 75 years or 80, hopefully, 100, I don't know. I pray that,
Be a long time.
no, we'll see how long. But my point is that no matter how long the journey is, I want to embrace everything so that me and my husband can continue to get to know one another, and the same is true for God. I feel like there'll never be a place where I've reached the top of the mountain and I understand God fully. I don't think that's true. I think we're constantly God's constantly revealing who He is to us, and that really impacts our life a lot and helps us take those next steps or grow or mature.
Yeah, spot on. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time today to share with us a little bit about your journey toward intimacy with God and your husband. Do you have any closing words of encouragement?
For anyone listening right now, especially the wives who maybe feel disheartened or in despair, those who feel completely hopeless, I was there. I remember wanting to give up. I remember hating my husband and feeling disgusted by him and wanting any other life but the one that I had. But God is a good God, and He truly does love us and care about where we are in our circumstances. And all I needed was hope for the next day. I just needed a little bit of hope, a little bit of light to guide me through the next day. So don't look at this as, don't look at your circumstances and say, I need all of this fixed right now and I need a perfect life. Take it one day at a time and just ask God to help you get through that one day. And then when that next day comes, ask for another day. So, and I believe He'll give it to you. He'll send people in your life to encourage you. He'll send messages through His Word. He'll send all kinds of love and just affirmation, and it will give you the hope. You just have to be open to it. So take some time today and pray and ask God to open up your eyes to see that hope and encouragement so that you can persevere.
Well, thank you. Those are great words, and um, I know I've been in a place before where I feel like there's just I can't deal with the rest of my life, and such wisdom there. Just deal with one day at a time. God gives us enough grace for each day. So, Jen,
Yeah.
thank you again for taking time. I appreciate you taking
Thank
the
you
time,
so much for having me. Yeah.
sending off your kid to the park. Your
Yeah.
husband. My
No,
little
this is great.
one was like on the door beating, like mom.
I know they always want our attention.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being a part of the launch team for the book and just sharing about it, because I really feel like this is a message that God wants to spread and move, and I was just grateful for your willingness to do that.
Oh, absolutely. It was my pleasure to do that. And I really hope that the book and this message gets in the hands of a lot of women, because that's what God desires. He wants intimacy with us, and He wants intimacy in our marriages, and that glorifies God. So thank you for writing that message and for
Absolutely.
spread it. Well, Jen, you have a fantastic day. Again, everyone, you can find Jennifer Smith at the Unveiled Wife. Is it Unveiled or the Unveiled?
It's unveiledwife.com.
Unveiledwife.com. And you can get her book on Amazon. I'll have a link to it in the show notes as well. Um, but thank you so much for taking the time again to be on this interview. And I hope you have a blessed day.
Awesome. Okay, bye.
Bye.